Prison riots are never a good thing, but some are worse than others. The most violent prison riots in history all started for one of two reasons: incredibly poor living conditions or gang warfare. Today, we're about to take you through the top 10 most deadly prison riots of all time, each one more gruesome than the last. We'll start you off slowly and work our way to the most deadly prison riot in history. Just when you think it can't get any worse, it will. The tropical islands of the Philippines are surrounded by beautiful aqua water and coconut trees as far as the eye can see. Unfortunately, it's also the country where the 10th most deadly prison riot began. The prison riot at Davao Metro Discom took place from August 13th to August 15th in 1989. The riot began when 16 prisoners escaped from their cells. They had planned to riot due to the poor conditions in the prison. In order to gain attention, the escapees took 15 civilian hostages from a visiting Protestant church group called the Joyful Assembly of God. The church members would pray to God to help them survive. Unfortunately, not everyone's prayers were answered. The prisoners were members of the Wild Boys of the Dape Coal Gang. They held the hostages for ransom until their demands were met. Their asking price: better conditions in the prison. The Davao police called in the military and launched a rescue. Troops and police moved in with machine guns and riot equipment. They had tried ending the riot peacefully, but the prisoners would not give up and began harming the hostages. The authorities could not allow this, so they went in guns blazing. 21 people lost their lives in the raid. All 16 inmates were killed and 5 hostages were murdered. But this riot is nothing compared to what's coming up. The next deadliest prison riot took place in Iquique, Chile in May of 2001. Like the riot in Davao, this riot started due to the unbearable prison conditions the inmates were living in. Unlike Davao, no hostages were taken, but massive destruction was brought upon the prison itself. One of the issues was overcrowding, which meant that when the riot started, there were a lot of inmates ready to join in the mayhem. The riot started with the prisoners overwhelming the guards and freeing other inmates as they made their way through the building. To make their displeasure clear, they started to destroy the prison. This culminated in the inmates lighting a large fire that quickly engulfed part of the prison. The building had been built almost 20 years prior, and little attention was given to fireproofing the structure. The fire raged out of control, consuming any inmates in its path. It wasn't until hours later that the authorities were finally able to get the blaze under control and disband the rioting prisoners. By this point, the flames had claimed 28 inmates and injured 150 more. The riot was not deadly because of inmate violence, but because of the fire that got out of control. The same cannot be said about the next prison riot. No fire was started, but inmate-on-inmate violence was very prevalent. You won't believe what these prisoners did to one another. Venezuela's Santa Ana prison broke into a deadly riot on December of 2007. The prison itself held around 2,000 inmates, some of whom were the most violent and dangerous people in the country. The prison riot all started with an argument between an inmate and a guard. It's unclear who threw the first punch, but what ensued was pure violence and chaos. The inmates revolted. They used anything they could find to fight the guards. Once the prison personnel had been removed from the general vicinity, the prisoners turned their weapons on one another. Rival gangs hunted down their enemies. They used shovels or pieces of brick and concrete broken from the walls to attack one another. Some inmates even had homemade weapons that they'd been saving for such an occasion. At the end of the riot, 30 inmates lay dead from gang warfare. But what happens when the prison guards can't get away from the inmates? This next prison riot will definitely leave you more horrified than the previous 3. The New Mexico State Penitentiary riot lasted 2 days, starting on February 2, 1980. Like other riots, the prisoners were revolting against the atrocious conditions in the prison. Things like unsanitary cells, poor quality food, and the cancellation of their education program were the main causes of the riot. As a result of these conditions, the inmates took 12 officers hostage. The first officer was overpowered by 2 inmates. After he was secured, other prisoners followed suit and began capturing guards around the prison. In their haste, the fleeing prison guards did not lock the doors behind them. The inmates got a hold of the keys from the captured officers' belts and began unlocking the cells of even more prisoners. Then, the chaos really began. The freed prisoners began smashing windows and doors. They grabbed weapons and more keys to unlock more cells. Eventually, the inmates turned on each other and rival gang members started attacking one another. The officers that were being held hostage were beaten and raped. The police eventually took back control of the prison. 33 inmates were killed and more than 200 were injured. The 12 officers who were taken hostage all survived, but after what they'd been put through, many may have wished they hadn't. It's crazy what prisoners will do when in a riot. And we're not even halfway through the list of the most violent prison riots in history. It's just gonna get crazier and crazier. The next riot is actually a combination of prison riots in Guatemala in 2005. The reason these riots are grouped together is because they were all carried out by the same gangs in coordination with one another. The prison riots of Pavon, Granja Pino Cañada, and El Hoyon all were orchestrated by the Mara Salvatrucha and MS-13 gangs. The attacks and subsequent riots within the prisons were carried out using heavier weapons than in any of the previous accounts. The gangs used grenades to open up holes in the prison's defenses. In the confusion, the prisoners were able to riot against the guards. They got their hands on knives and guns, which they used on the guards and each other. 35 inmates died during the coordinated riots. 61 prisoners were injured at El Hoyon alone. Many were found bleeding from the knife wounds. Now this next prison riot is a little more well known, and for good reason. It took 4 days for the police to regain control and ended with an $8 million settlement in favor of the prisoners. This riot was called the Attica Prison Riot and happened in New York. The riot started on September 9, 1971. It seemed like just another day, except the command staff of the prison had decided to change the scheduling a bit. Unfortunately, they did not inform the officer who was in charge of leading the group of men in 5 Company to their next location. The group normally went out into the yard right after breakfast, but on this day the guard found the door to the yard locked. The inmates realized the officer was confused and capitalized on it. They overpowered the guard. The rioters then ran back down the hallway, gaining more and more inmates as they went. The 1,000-person mob began to brutally beat the guards and took their weapons. They burnt down the prison chapel. 42 officers and staff were taken hostage. The riot itself was not the craziest part about the story, however. After 4 days of the inmates running the prison, the state police finally gained back control. They did so by killing 39 people. Although some inmates needed to be subdued, the police were accused of shooting prisoners who had surrendered in cold blood. The most messed up part of the situation, though, was the killing of 10 hostages. The hostages were not killed by the inmates, but by the state police. They tried to cover up their mistake, but the autopsy reports proved that the hostages had been shot dead by weapons used by the state police. In the end, the injured inmates filed a lawsuit against the state. They received a settlement for $8 million for the unlawful action of the police and state officials, and for violation of human rights. We're now getting to the top of our list. The amount of violence is gonna skyrocket, so just be ready. For our next violent prison riot, we're going to head back to South America to the country of Brazil. There were 3 riots that took place at the Inicio Jobim Penitentiary Complex in Manaus, Brazil in January of 2017. All of the riots were between 2 rival drug trafficking gangs called Família do Norte and Primeiro Comando de Capital. What stands out most about these riots are how brutal they were. The prison riots at the Inicio Jobim Penitentiary Complex were orchestrated to kill rival gang members, not to harm the officers at the prison. The riots resulted in 60 prisoners losing their lives on the very first day. The most gruesome part is that the rival gang members did not just kill one another, they tortured each other. In many cases, the torture ended with decapitation. These riots had little to do with protesting prison conditions and everything to do with gang warfare. This brings us to our top 3 most violent prison riots of all time. There are parts of these riots that were even hard for us to believe because of how crazy they were. Buckle in for a wild ride. For the 3rd most violent prison riot, we're back in Venezuela. The Urbana prison riot began on January 25, 2013. This riot was triggered by an announcement that Venezuelan National Guard troops would be searching the facility for weapons. This was part of an anti-gang task force. Knowing that the National Guard would not like what they found, the prisoners rioted. Everyone was a target in this riot. Inmates, officers, and National Guard troops were all part of the final death count. The violence became so bad that after the riot was over, bodies mutilated beyond recognition were found. These heinous acts led human rights groups to condemn the prison, citing that overcrowding and inhumane conditions were partly the reason for the riot. 61 people were killed, and 120 others were injured during the event. We're now at the penultimate most violent prison riot in history. We hope you're ready because there's no way you'll see what's coming in these last 2 prison riots. El Porvenir prison in Honduras was used to hold suspects on trial for assault, drug trafficking, and rape charges. On April 6, 2003, the worst of the worst began the riot at El Porvenir prison. A fight erupted between the 2 rival gangs of Mara Salvatrucha and La 18. Like the Attica prison, the destructive method of choice for the rioters was to set stuff on fire. The gang members then set the mattresses of their rivals on fire while they were locked in the cells. Although there was some fighting during the riot, the fire is what claimed most lives. It took firefighters hours to put out the blaze. When it was contained and authorities proceeded through the prison to get the riot under control, they found 86 dead inmates, all burnt to a crisp. You've made it to the most violent prison riot in history. This last prison riot is so violent that it was named the Karanjiru Massacre. It broke out on October 2, 1992, at the Karanjiru Penitentiary in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The riot got so bad that the military police were called upon to subdue the inmates. Unfortunately for everyone involved in the riot, they did a lot more than just subdue them. The police came into the prison weapons hot, and 102 prisoners were shot dead. The officers were later accused of human rights violations and using excessive force. Accounts surfaced of prisoners being shot even after they surrendered. Survivors recounted police shooting inmates who were hiding in their cells, but the Sao Paulo court found the police innocent and no charges were carried out. Out of the 68 officers who were sent in to break up the riot, not a single one was killed, which makes you wonder why so many of the inmates had to die. There were also 9 inmates found stabbed to death by other prisoners, which brings the death toll of the most violent prison riot in history to 111 people, all of which were inmates. Prisons are already dangerous, but when riots break out, they can be deadly. This list is by no means the only prison riots that have occurred, but they are the deadliest. As a rule of thumb, it's probably just best to stay out of gangs, prison, or prison riots if you value your life. Now check out how to survive inside prison, or watch 50 insane facts about prison you wouldn't believe.